Hello, I think we're on the air now. Hello, I think we're on the air now. Just close the duplicate windows here so we don't get feedback. We'll get started on the presentation at 7 o'clock sharp. Okay, I have one request. If anyone can hear me, if they can see the questions, the Q&A tab to the right of the screen, if you can try asking a test question, we can see how that works. I've only seen questions I've asked, and I'm not entirely sure I have it working correctly. But we give that a shot, and we should be good to go. No, that's the wrong one. Link was wrong. Link was very, very wrong. All right, stand by. Correct the link on. Unfortunately, Forrest, it is a one-way street. I cannot hear you. That would be a really great feature for Google to add, but I can see the questions there. There are things like Google Hangouts where you can see everyone, but it's limited to, I think, 8 people or something. So when we have a larger group, we won't be able to do that. But I see that we got the Q&A working. And I see Mohammed's post, so I'll get started. Thanks, guys, for joining. I look forward to getting your feedback on this presentation so that when we give it to a larger audience, it'll be most effective for them, and you guys get an early look. So you should see some slides right now. And just go. Okay, you should be able to see the slides. This is a spectrum primer for IoT. A crash course on radio theory and regulation for IoT makers and hackers. So the assumption here is that, like you two I know are involved in the tech, but don't necessarily have a background in the physics or the radio side of it, and you could use just a crash course to fill in some of that background. I've divided up the talk into several sections. Overall, should last about 45 minutes, including time for some questions along the way. First, we'll talk about the anatomy of a radio wave, the physics behind radio, but without any equations, I promise. Look at a brief history of radio spectrum, how it's been looked at over the years, and how we've come to have the bands that we have today, why we're operating at 900 megahertz and not somewhere else. We'll look briefly at different types of modulation to see what's the difference between Morse code and LoRa and software-defined radio, how that fits in there. And finally, there's a plug for the Things Network that I don't need to give to you guys. But we have that in the end there when presenting to a larger group who may not be familiar with what we do. So jumping right into it, let's look at what a radio wave is and give you some mental tools for thinking about radio that should prove useful when you are thinking about your applications, when you're setting up gateways, and when you're explaining it to other people. So first we'll look at generating a radio wave. So typically the way that you generate a radio wave is you have an antenna, in this case the gray cylinder there, placed above ground, the green lawn. Both the ground and the antenna contain electrons. These electrons carry electrical charge. So all materials have electrons. Conductors have electrons that are free to move around in the material. If we apply a voltage to that antenna, that is, literally you could take a 9-volt battery and connect the negative side of the battery to the ground and the positive side of the battery to the antenna. It draws electrons from one of the conductors, so say from the ground, up into the antenna. The exact direction is not important, but the idea is that you can, using a voltage like that you get from a battery, you can force extra electrons into one conductor, say into the antenna. And this creates an electric field around, coming from the ground up to the antenna. This electric field is what you feel when you rub a balloon in your hair and pull it away and you see your hair moving without the balloon touching you. That attraction between charged objects is electric field. What we learned from Maxwell's theory, which was developed back in the late 1800s, is that a changing electric field actually generates a magnetic field. So you see this electric field that was generated by the electrons moving up into the antenna when we attached our battery. That creates magnetic field as a ring around the antenna. And that changing magnetic field in turn creates more electric field. It's similar to dropping a pebble in the water. It creates a depression in the water, but then because of gravity, that depression now raises up and creates a ring around where you drop the pebble in the water. And after several seconds, you have a number of concentric rings moving out away from where you threw in the pebble. The same thing happens when you apply a voltage to an antenna. So we'd get more and more generation of magnetic field traveling out in all directions forever. If you now alternate pulling electrons into and out of the antenna at some frequency. That is, you do it 1 time per second, or you do it 100 times per second, or 1,000,000 times per second. You're pulling electrons in and out of the antenna. You'll create a wave known as a radio wave that travels out in all directions, also known as electromagnetic radiation. The radiation part doesn't mean that it's harmful. It simply means that it travels out on a radius. And we'll see where the ionizing radiation like X-rays and gamma rays that can cause harm to you, even in small amounts, later. But the low frequency radio waves that we're talking about here do not cause radiation poisoning in the sense of X-rays. So that's how we generate radio waves. How do we receive radio waves? Receiving radio waves, it works exactly in the opposite direction. It works exactly the same way, but opposite to generating radio waves. So here's a visual example. We've got a magnetic field coming in towards our antenna, all right? That magnetic field may have been generated by another antenna some distance away. The changing magnetic field creates an electric field, which creates an alternating magnetic field, now close to the antenna, which creates an electric field. And now, just like electrons moving create an electric field finally reaching the antenna from another antenna draws electrons up into the antenna. And then when the field reverses some fraction of a second later, because the battery or the generator of these waves at the other antenna has been reversed, it pushes the electrons out of the antenna. So if we attach this antenna to a computer that is capable of measuring the voltage on the antenna over time, we can actually pick out a signal. Now, I'm greatly oversimplifying here, but that's the basic idea of how radio waves work. And there's some references at the end of the talk if you want to get more into the physics, but that's the basic thing to remember. Electrons pumping in and out of the antenna, creating fields that then travel out in all directions. So now here's a diagram of an antenna, the little black line there in the center. I see your question, Forrest. I'll get to it right at the end of the section. And actually, we're going to address that next, how this was done before computers. So just to give you another visual, here's an antenna located in the center of a field. The horizontal line represents the ground, and the little hashed lines below it represent the earth. Everything above that horizontal line is air. And this is a cutaway view looking from the side. That antenna, oh good, I think you can see my mouse. So the antenna has electrons traveling into and out of it, let's say 1,000 times a second. And because of that, we've generated these waves which are traveling out away from the antenna, incidentally at the speed of light. Now, if you were to put a little test antenna some distance away, some fixed point, some distance away from the antenna, and measure the number of crests of this electromagnetic wave passing that point every second, you'd measure the frequency of this radio wave. If you noted 1,000 cycles of the wave every second, then you'd have a radio wave of 100 hertz, or 100 cycles per second. Hertz is the name of an early innovator in radio. Previously, we just referred to cycles per second, but we've used his name now that he's been dead long enough, I guess. The other important way of looking at and measuring a radio wave is wavelength. So if you take a snapshot in time and look at where the crests of the wave are located and measure the distance between them, not that it's actually practical to do that, but if you could freeze time and make measurements at different points in space and see where the crests of the wave are, you would measure the wavelength, which they write with a lambda, and it's measured in meters. In the early days of radio, frequencies were actually, they didn't use frequencies. People used wavelengths, and early radio receivers actually were indicated in a number of meters. So 600 meters, 160 meters, and this is what people had on their AM radio dials. But today we found it more convenient to use frequency to measure the radio waves. They're completely equivalent measurements because the speed of the wave is fixed. Now we're talking about different frequencies of radio waves. I mentioned a rate of a frequency of 1,000 cycles per second. If you look at this chart on the right, we have frequency on the left-hand side. And if you go all the way to the bottom on the left-hand side, you'll see a 10 to the 6. This line on the chart, where it says AM, this represents the frequency of radio waves which are used for AM broadcast, like you have in your car stereo. The 10 to the 6 means 10, a 1 with 6 zeros after it, or 1 million hertz. So AM radio signals are vibrating about 1 million times per second, also known as 1 megahertz. As you move up this chart, each line on the left represents a 10 times increase in the frequency of the radio wave. So we get up to 10 to the 8. I know it's a bit small there, but here where it says radio TV, that's 10 to the 8. That is 100 megahertz, which is about what your FM radio stations use. 10 to the 9 is 1 gigahertz, or 1 billion cycles per second. And we get up a little bit higher and we have 2.4 gigahertz. We get up into microwaves, where your microwave oven operates. So the microwaves in your microwave oven are the same thing physically, as the same phenomenon as the radio waves received in your FM stereo or your AM radio. The only difference is that they're at a higher frequency of vibration. As we increase the frequency further, a very interesting thing happens. We go all the way up to 10 to the 15th power cycles per second, and these waves become visible to the eye as what we call light. So there's actually a band of frequencies of radio waves which are visible to the human eye that we call the colors of the rainbow. This red, orange, yellow, green, blue set of colors is often referred to as a spectrum. So we use the term spectrum to also refer to the whole range or the whole spectrum of electromagnetic waves, including radio waves that were developed in the 20s for AM broadcast, all the way up to X-rays and gamma rays used in cancer treatment, and to rays that go right through your body for scanning your bones. When people refer to radio, though, they typically mean from about 100 gigahertz and down. So we're not talking about light, but talking about microwaves and lower frequency radio. Because there's such a huge range here, we're looking at many orders of magnitude, or each of these ticks on this chart are 10 times difference. And because the properties of these waves change throughout the spectrum, it's helpful to use some terms to divide up this spectrum. So radio waves from 300 kilohertz, that's 300,000 cycles per second, to 3 megahertz are known as MF, or medium frequency. And the use that people generally know it for is AM broadcast. From 3 megahertz to 300 megahertz is known as HF, or high frequency. This used to be very popular because these waves bounce off the upper atmosphere and allow intercontinental communication, very long distance communication, even with small amounts of power. So it's used for shortwave radio broadcast, CB radio, and by radio experimenters and hobbyists. When we get up above 30 megahertz, the signals don't bounce off the upper atmosphere anymore, and so they become more reliable for short-range communications. This very high frequency, or VHF, is most commonly used for FM broadcast, but it's also used for your walkie-talkies, for commercial radios like police radios. UHF, or ultra high frequency, is 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz. And these waves now do not travel quite as far as the VHF, but because of the high frequency, there's a lot more bandwidth available for private use. So this is where Wi-Fi and LoRaWAN are located, in the UHF part of the spectrum, which is indicated over here in this expanded part of the plot. And above 3 gigahertz, we have super high frequency, which in communications is pretty much only used for microwave backhaul. That's used for point-to-point communication between radio towers as a replacement for fiber optic cables. So the takeaway from this is, if you want to find yourself on the map, if you're using LoRaWAN, you're located in the UHF, or ultra high frequency part of the spectrum, which is at 900 megahertz, located right about here in the radio spectrum. So Forrest asked the very good question of, how was this done before computers? If you don't have a computer to generate signals and analyze a signal present at an antenna. I'd like to give a little historical overview so you can see where radio came from and how it's been seen through the decades. I think it pays to look at the history because it just puts things in a perspective that you don't get by just getting the snapshot that we have today. So I'll first show you something that predates radio so you can understand the context in which radio was invented. So Samuel Morse, he was involved in the invention of the telegraph. He didn't actually invent the original telegraph, but he was commissioned by the US government to build a telegraph that is using a telegraph key, such as drawn on the left there. It's simply just a switch that you can operate with your hand by depressing this lever. He built a telegraph from Washington, D.C., from the Supreme Court, I believe, to his office in Baltimore, where there was located a receiving device which pounded a needle into paper whenever the switch was depressed in Washington, 60 kilometers away. just by sending an electrical signal down and operating an electromagnet. And there's a ground wire returning. I drew a potato battery here. I actually don't know what kind of battery Samuel Morse used. I don't think they were potato-based, but they were very primitive batteries. And anyway, what Morse was able to do is by tapping on the key, the switch in Washington, and sending a code, long, short, some predefined code, he was able to communicate a message to his partner, Alfred Vail, in Baltimore. And the first thing which was sent, incidentally, is, "What hath God wrought?" And I think this was a celebratory statement. So the telegraph was used for communicating messages all around the country. But a few decades later, Marconi, an Italian inventor, developed an apparatus which allowed a telegraph to operate without wires. He called it the wireless telegraph. And essentially, the telegraph key was connected to batteries and an induction coil. If you don't know what an induction coil is, all you have to do is open up pretty much any gasoline-powered car, and you'll find an ignition system which uses an induction coil to generate sparks in a spark plug. He used essentially the same principle to generate sparks whenever he tapped this telegraph key. Those sparks would generate a high voltage that, using primitive capacitors and inductors, was tuned to force electrons into and out of an antenna. That generated radio waves, which were received by a receiving antenna some distance away into a very primitive detector that he used. And actually, his first experiments didn't even use headphones, but he soon developed a way to listen to the signal, listen to a sound that represented the signal. And in this way, he was able to duplicate Morse's experiment and send a signal first just across his laboratory and soon across the Atlantic Ocean. Here's, just for your information, an actual picture of Marconi's original apparatus. At left is his first transmitter, and that he developed in 1894. He had this piece of copper foil as an antenna. At this time, the principles of radio, even the very basic form that we talked about at the beginning of the talk, was just not understood. So yeah, 1901, Marconi demonstrated the first transatlantic telegraph message. So using a massive antenna drawn up into the air by a kite on the beach, he transmitted a message from the New World back to Europe, and had to do it twice because the first time nobody believed him. And very quickly, just 8 years later, he along with one of his collaborators, won the Nobel Prize for the work. So it was really a very big deal at the time in science. Now, let's take a look at what the spectrum of Marconi's transmitter looked like. So the spark gap transmitter generates a signal at all frequencies at the same time. It's basically white noise. So if you looked at Marconi sending a dit and then a dash, that is a short pulse and then a long pulse, which in Morse code represents the letter A, then he's essentially occupying all frequencies during the period of that dit, and then all frequencies during the period of the dash. So this means that if multiple people want to use the airwaves at the same time for transmitting a message, they essentially need to just wait, listen for the previous station to finish its transmission, and then continue with your transmission. This actually worked, and it's known as time division multiple access, or TDMA. You'll actually see that acronym TDMA a lot. It just means there's a single channel on which information can be communicated, in this case, electromagnetic waves, and multiple users are able to access it by dividing up time. So they would share time slots. And an elderly friend of mine told me a story where his father had an experimental radio transmitter transmitting at 1,000 watts down in the Carolinas, and he used to enjoy communicating with people in Europe, I think in England, over the ocean. And he used a spark gap transmitter that used up all of the available spectrum, essentially. And when he would be transmitting too long, and the Navy station just a few miles away got tired of listening to him chatting with people in England, maybe the Navy needed to communicate with the ship, they would send a message QRT in Morse code, which means stop transmitting. And so literally the Navy would have to tell the experimenter to stop transmitting so that they could communicate with their ships. Obviously a mess. And this technology really limited the usability of radio. Now, over the course of the next few years, were developed techniques to tune transmitters so that they use less spectrum, so that ultimately only a single frequency was required to transmit a message. So the picture on the right here, you can see this is a Morse code signal. My squiggles represent that some range of frequency is required, some channel width or bandwidth is required to send this signal. But the message can be sent on a single frequency. So this allows multiple users to use the spectrum at the same time. And that's called frequency division multiple access, or FDMA. What was decided in Berlin between, I think, 9 countries in 1909 was that they were going to split up the spectrum so that 350 kilohertz and down, 350,000 cycles per second, was considered the most valuable part of the spectrum, and it was given to government and military use globally. The frequencies of 500 and 1,000 kilohertz were to be used for commercial use. And 1,500 kilohertz and up was given to amateurs to just experiment with and do whatever they wanted with. This part of the radio spectrum, 1,500 kilohertz and up, and 1.5 megahertz plus, was really considered essentially useless. Well, how wrong could people be? It was very quickly discovered that once you got up above about 3 megahertz, really interesting things started to happen with the radio waves. You would get propagation, or you get signals that could travel worldwide with very little power, just a few watts of power. And then above that, as we saw in the spectrum slides, there's a capability for a very reliable local communication. But the original spectrum allocation was just to separate the government, commercial, and amateur users so that they weren't interfering with each other. So soon after 1909, the radio telephone was invented, essentially just a wireless telephone. Originally, it wasn't thought that this could be used for broadcast. It wasn't until 1921 that someone, I believe it was an employee of Westinghouse Corporation, had the bright idea that they could give a bunch of radio telephone receivers to people and then give live coverage of the presidential election in 1921 by transmitting from the top of a building in Philadelphia. And the idea really caught on, and after just a few years, there were hundreds of radio stations around the country, all broadcasting on that 500 or 1,000 kilohertz frequencies that we saw on the previous slide, because they're commercial stations. Congress had no right to deny stations So although there was a licensing process, Congress did not have the jurisdiction to deny people the license. Also, a weird thing started to happen where stations that had been operating for a few years on one frequency, if they were interfered with by another station, they would claim that they had property rights to that spectrum and that the other stations had to cease their operation. It was the legal-minded people in the field feared that quickly the whole spectrum would be owned by private interests, and the huge public benefit that radio could bring might not be realized. So in 1934, the FCC was created to ensure that radio spectrum would be used only in the public interest. So whatever complaints we may have about the FCC from time to time, their charter is actually to use radio for the public interest. One of the most important things that the FCC has done, and other organizations around the world which serve the same purpose as the FCC in other countries, is to create what is called ISM bands. So this stands for Industrial, Scientific, and Medical. The idea is that not all spectrum was used for communications. Some devices, such as microwave oven, pictured it right here, could use radio waves to accomplish other things than communication, such as cooking your food or burning a pile of raisins, which is apparently what this is. These devices generated huge amounts of interference, and if every manufacturer of a microwave picked a different frequency to operate the microwave on, then it would pretty much destroy microwaves for microwave radio as a way to communicate. So it was decided to create specific ranges of frequency, which would be used only for industrial, scientific, or medical equipment, which microwaves fall under that for whatever reason. Basically as junk bands where you could radiate as much as you want, and you weren't going to cause any interference because no one's using it for communication. No license required. Well, a very interesting thing happened where people started using these bands really just designed to throw all the junk radiation. They started using these bands for short-range wireless devices because no license was required. You didn't have to apply to the FCC and pay large sums of money to get the right to use the radio spectrum. The downside of it is that you had to put up with interference from microwave ovens, from medical equipment, and from industrial users. So jumping forward to today, essentially, the large chunks of the spectrum are really only for military, public service, or government use. Most of the spectrum is only for government use. There's still a very generous allocation for amateurs, that is for radio experimenters. You can get a license inexpensively if you want to experiment with radio, and you're allowed to use quite a range of spectrum. But only for non-commercial purposes. So it doesn't really work for most of the IoT applications that we're looking at. Radio and TV broadcast, cellular networks, they have quite a bit of spectrum allocated to them. But these network providers pay license fees up in the 9 figures. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars to buy channels. So clearly, this is not going to work for a startup if you need your own spectrum. There's a number of other radio services like Citizens Band, right? CB radio, FRS, Family Radio Service, which is the walkie-talkies you can buy in Walmart, and a few others, which are available to the public without a license. But there's very tight regulation around what can be done with these parts of the spectrum. Such as they can only be used for voice communication and limited power. But in the ISM bands, you're pretty much allowed to do anything if you keep your transmit power under a certain limit. Now, I'm oversimplifying here, but the premise is that these bands were allocated for junk. So the idea is you can't really break what's already broken. Go ahead and experiment with this. If you can do anything useful with these bands other than burn your raisins, then more power to you. And that's why we use the ISM bands. 2.4 gigahertz, which Wi-Fi originally ran on and mostly runs on today, is an ISM band. The 5 gigahertz, the new Wi-Fi standards, is also an ISM band. And below that, 900 megahertz, the 902 to 928 megahertz that we use for LoRaWAN, is another ISM band. So cordless phones, microphones, garage door openers, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, and now LoRa and LoRaWAN are all built around this relatively unregulated spectrum. So I'd like to cover one other topic here, besides just looking at the range of different frequencies and how they're shared between different services. We can also look at how, on a single frequency, you manipulate the radio wave in order to communicate information. This is called modulation. So up at the top, we see a sketch of what a Morse code signal looks like, also known as CW, or continuous wave. So if you want to send the characters CQ, you'd look up on a chart that a C is a long tone followed by, I say a tone, I just mean transmit at the frequency you want to use for, say, a second, and then transmit for a half a second, and then for a full second, and for a half a second, and that communicates the character C. And similarly, there's a code for Q and the other letters of the alphabet. And looking at right, here's a picture from a spectrogram that shows you what that signal looks like when it's received. This is actually sending something else, not CQ. Now, this was great for communicating between telegraph operators with messages between humans, but not so great for computers to talk to each other. So this mode of modulating the radio, that is turning the transmitter on and off, was adapted to use by computers with a mode called on-off keying, where you transmit for a period of time to indicate a 1 and don't transmit for a period of time to indicate a 0. And you can transmit bytes and megabytes in that fashion. It turns out that on-off keying is kind of inefficient, and it has some problems, like if you want to send a whole bunch of zeros, you don't know if the station has just stopped transmitting or if it's sending you a bunch of zeros. There's other technical reasons why on-off keying is not the best, but it's kind of the simplest to think of. A more sophisticated way of manipulating the radio wave to communicate information is called FSK, or frequency shift keying. This is where you use two different frequencies, one to represent a 1 and the other to represent a 0. And you alternate between these two frequencies in order to convey your message. And this has the huge advantage that the receiver can know if it's receiving the station on the other end, or whether it's disappeared, or whether it stopped transmitting. And you see it right here, a picture of what an actual FSK signal looks like when it's being received. Now, the range of FSK is limited because the receiver needs to be able to clearly differentiate these two signal levels. And like trying to understand someone whistling two different tones at the other end of a stadium just after a score has been made, that whistle is going to get completely drowned out. That signal will not be audible with all the background noise. So there's new modulation techniques relatively recently developed, such as LoRa, which use a different technique. Instead of just two different frequencies, they use a chirp. That is, they generate a chirp that sounds much like a bird whistle, starting at a low frequency and going up to a high frequency. So a chirp from low to high frequency across some bandwidth represents a 1, and a chirp from high frequency down to low frequency represents a 0. And the width of this signal is about 125 kilohertz in LoRaWAN. That 125,000 cycles per second of difference, that is a large amount of spectrum and much more than would be traditionally required for a Morse code signal. Morse code signal, for example, only needs about 300 hertz of bandwidth, and here we're using 125,000 hertz of bandwidth to communicate the same data rate. However, the huge advantage here is that even if this signal is deeply buried in noise, it's possible for the receiver to pick out that chirp and pick out the direction of it. So that's about as detailed as we can go into it without really a mathematical explanation. But this is just a mental picture that you can keep in mind when thinking about LoRa. And when you look at other documents, if you're curious to go deeper, this perspective might help you. Today, there's even more exotic modes of manipulating radio, which you can do purely by software. As I mentioned earlier, computers can be used to directly manipulate antennas for reception and for transmission. And that's what a software-defined radio, or SDR, can do. So here's just a picture of somebody actually cheating at Pokemon Go without leaving his lab by using a software-defined radio that you see at the right here to fake a GPS signal so that the phone thinks that the user is walking around traveling to different Pokestops or going down the street or whatever. But the phone is actually just sitting right here, and he's generating a fake GPS signal at about 1.2 gigahertz using a computer. And it does not require building a GPS transmitter. It only requires downloading the software for a GPS transmitter and connecting it to a software-defined radio. So we don't really have time to go into that, but I just want you to be aware that it is possible to use purely software to manipulate radio waves. I have this slide in here showing relative advantages and disadvantages of various IoT networks. I'm going to skip over this and just leave it here for your information. I will share the slides out in a few minutes. But essentially, the punchline is, if you only have a small amount of data to send every day, the Things network is awesome. Don't use anything else. If you need to send a lot of data, don't use the Things network. That's the punchline. And we already know this, Forrest and Mohammed, but worldwide effort for the Things network. We're combining cutting-edge modulation, LoRa, which is much more efficient than previous things like Morse code, on-off keying, or FSK, with the free-to-use 915 megahertz spectrum, which originally was intended just for junk radiation. Focusing on long range, low cost, low power consumption. And the key part with spectrum is that low cost is related to free to use spectrum. And we know that we know all this since we're the Things network. I just want to give you 3 quick ideas on what you can do if you're really excited by the radio, these radio concepts, and then I'll address first question I see. So one thing you can do very inexpensively is get a software-defined radio receiver. They cost less than $10 even, amazingly. These are receivers that were actually designed to receive digital television, but they can be hacked to receive pretty much any signal from 30 megahertz to 3 gigahertz. And there's a website here where you can read all about this. So people like are analyzing cell phone signals, looking at IoT devices, tracking aircraft, and doing it all with $10 dongles plugged into their laptops. It's really incredible, and there's a whole world there you can discover. Another thing you can do is actually become a radio amateur. You can get a license to operate with essentially as much power as you could ever want, up to 1,500 watts of power in any part of the radio spectrum. There's a generous chunks of the spectrum which are still allocated to amateur experimental use. And although it doesn't relate directly to the Things Network, if you're curious about radio, this is a great way to experiment. And even just studying for the license exam, there is an exam to get the license covering very rudimentary knowledge. But that background knowledge would also be really helpful in thinking about the Things Network. So something to look at if you find the radio stuff interesting beyond its applications. And lastly, of course, join the Things Network meetup, which we're already on. So Forrest asks about LoRa chirps. How many ones and zeros are in a bit? How many bits would one send over LoRa when adhering to TTN best practices? And what could one send within data limits re TTN? So if we look at the view that I gave you here in the modes, just shows how individual bits, that is a 1 or a 0, which is a bit, it just shows how ones and zeros translate into physical radio waves. 8 bits are a byte. There are 2 to the 8th power combination of 8 bits. That 2 to the 8th power is 256, and 256 is enough different values to represent all of the characters in the Latin alphabet that we use to write English, plus numbers and symbols and a bunch of special characters. And that's why we use 8 bits to the byte. When adhering to TTN best practices, so at a level higher, which isn't shown on this drawing, which could be the subject of another discussion, but when you send many bytes, you need to somehow format them so that the receiver knows that the meaning of each bit and what it corresponds to. So a TTN packet consists of between like 12 and a few hundred bytes of information. And some of that is used for the network to communicate, to say what node is transmitting, and sequence numbers, acknowledgements, things that you don't need to worry about as the application developer. In terms of the number of bytes you can send, according to the Things Network Fair Use Policy, the rule of thumb I tell people is if you can send 10 byte payloads, that is, if you can, for your application, use 10 bytes less than 30 times a day, then the Things Network is definitely the network for you. If you need to send 100 bytes 30 times a day, the Things Network is still probably a good choice. If you need to send streaming data very, very often, like once a minute or more often, or you need to send images, then it's not going to work with the fair use policy. So Mohammed asks, what other factors govern network protocols besides the frequency bands they operate on? That's a good question, and I need to be more clear on that. So thank you very much for asking. So the FCC regulations on specifying how radio spectrum may be used are publicly available, and you can read them. They don't make for very exciting reading, but I happen to find some of it interesting. Essentially, they first break down the spectrum by frequency, as I showed you, and then within each band of frequency, they specify some additional rules, typically around the amount of power that can be used by a transmitter. So in the 900 megahertz ISM band, for example, you're allowed to transmit between 902 megahertz and 928 megahertz using no more than 1 watt of power. So that's, I mean, if you think about a 100-watt light bulb that's lighting up your room, that it's 100 times less power than a light bulb. But that's actually enough power to transmit several miles, as we see with the Things network. There are also other rules governing, not actually networking protocols. The protocol isn't regulated, but how the modulation of the radio waves is regulated to some extent. Although thankfully in the ISM bands, you can pretty much use whatever modulation you want. So it's a good place to experiment with modulations. So that's all I've got. Thanks a lot for helping me out and attending. I'll share the slides, and if you want to read more about LoRa and how it works under the hood, there's a really good talk by Bastille Networks that Terry linked us to, which you might want to check out. I have linked at the end. The graphics from the mode slide were generated by the baudline spectrum analyzer, and there's a really cool blog that looks at visualizing signals, and a lot of signals from outer space, part of the SETI project. A lot of cool stuff generated by stars and asteroids and everything. It might be from ET, but unfortunately not. There's a website on software-defined radio called RTLSDR that could give you all sorts of cool ideas for what radio could be used for, especially around using software-defined radio. And there's a handbook by the ARRL, which is the American Radio Relay League. It's the amateur radio association in the United States. They put together this handbook that it's actually focused for amateur radio, but it gives really practical coverage of how radios are built, how to make antennas, how to test things. And it doesn't get bogged down in equations like a lot of school textbooks do. So if you want to read more about radio and really get into the details without getting bogged down, this is a great resource. And you can get for like $5, you can get like a 10-year-old copy online, and it's perfectly applicable to today. And if you happen to really like differential equations and mathematics, I link in also the classic text on radio, but it is brutal, but it's essential to list. So, hey guys, thanks for tagging along with me, and hope to see you all soon. Feel free to comment in the Slack if you have any other suggestions. Ciao.